I woke up that January morning to find a massive pile of snow and dirt towering over my eastern pasture, where my cattle usually grazed during the winter months. The mound had to be at least 30 feet high, and there were kids already sliding down it on plastic sleds, their laughter echoing across my property while their parents stood around sipping hot cocoa like they owned the place. My name is Carter Lawson, and I own a small cattle ranch on the outskirts of Bozeman, Montana. I inherited the property from my grandfather 5 years ago, and it sits right on the edge of the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision. When the HOA bought the land next to mine and developed it into a cookie-cutter neighborhood, I knew there would be problems, but I never imagined they would pull something like this. I pulled on my boots and winter coat, grabbed my phone, and headed out into the freezing morning air. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, and my breath came out in white clouds as I trudged through the snow toward the massive sledding hill that definitely had not been there yesterday. My 15 head of cattle were huddled near the barn, confused about why their grazing area had been transformed into a winter playground. As I got closer, I could see that the HOA had used heavy machinery to push snow and frozen earth from my pasture into this monstrosity. The tracks from the bulldozer and front loader were still visible in the crushed grass and mud. They had not only trespassed on my property, but had also destroyed a significant portion of my winter grazing land. A woman in a purple parka with fur trim was standing at the base of the hill, directing traffic like she was some kind of winter carnival coordinator. She had that distinctive haircut, the one where it is short in the back and longer in the front, and she was wearing enough makeup to stock a department store counter. I knew immediately that this had to be the work of the HOA president, whose name I would soon learn was Patricia Henderson. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached. "What exactly is going on here?" She turned to face me with a smile so fake it could have been made of plastic. "Oh, you must be the neighbor. Isn't this wonderful? We've created a community sledding hill for all the children in Meadowbrook Heights. The association voted on it last month." "On my property," I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. "You built this on my land without my permission." Patricia waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, there must be some confusion about the property lines. I'm sure this is part of the community common area. We had a survey done and everything." I pulled out my phone and opened the property map application I had downloaded when I first inherited the ranch. I zoomed in and showed her the clear boundary line that ran at least 50 feet west of where we were standing. "This is my property. You can see the survey markers right there." I pointed to the metal stakes that were now partially buried under the manufactured hill. Her smile faltered for just a moment before returning even brighter than before. "Well, I'll have to check with our records, but even if there was a minor miscalculation, surely you don't mind the children having a place to play. It's just for the winter season, community spirit and all that." "I mind when you destroy my pasture and trespass on my land," I replied. "I need you to remove this hill and restore my property to its original condition." Today, Patricia's expression hardened. "I'm afraid that's not possible. We've already invested considerable HOA funds into creating this amenity. The families here pay their dues and expect facilities for their children. Perhaps if you weren't so isolated out here with your farm animals, you would understand the importance of community." Several other parents had started to gather around us, sensing confrontation. A man in an expensive ski jacket spoke up. "Is there a problem here? We were told this was approved." "The problem is that you're all trespassing on my private property," I said, raising my voice slightly so everyone could hear. "This is not HOA land. This is my cattle pasture and you've destroyed it without permission." A murmur went through the crowd. Some people looked concerned, but others seemed annoyed that I was disrupting their winter fun. Patricia held up her hands in a placating gesture. "Everyone, please continue enjoying the hill. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding that we can resolve through proper channels." "The proper channel is for you to get off my land right now," I said. "All of you. And I want this hill removed by the end of the week, or I'll be calling both the sheriff and my attorney." Patricia's face flushed red, and her voice took on a sharp edge. "You can't just kick families with children off a community recreation area. This is harassment. I'll be filing a complaint with the county." "File whatever you want," I replied, "but you're still trespassing." I turned and walked back toward my house, pulling out my phone to take photos and videos of the destruction. The entire eastern section of my pasture had been torn up. They had used heavy equipment to scrape together snow, dirt, and frozen vegetation into a massive pile. The damage would take months to repair, and my cattle would have significantly less grazing area for the remainder of the winter. Back inside my house, I called the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and explained the situation. The dispatcher took my information and said they would send a deputy out to take a report. Then I called my attorney, a woman named Sarah Morrison, who had helped me with the property transfer when I inherited the ranch. "Carter, this is definitely trespassing and property damage," Sarah said after I explained what had happened. "Document everything. Take photos, videos, measurements. Get copies of your property survey and deed. I'll draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA, but given that they've already caused significant damage, you may want to consider filing a civil suit for the cost of repairs." "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "Depends on the extent of the damage." "Could be anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 once you factor in the cost of removing their hill, repairing the pasture, reseeding in the spring, and the loss of grazing land during recovery. Plus punitive damages if we can prove they knowingly trespassed." I spent the rest of the morning documenting the damage. I took dozens of photos from every angle, recorded video of the kids sledding on my property, and used a measuring tape to confirm exactly how far onto my land the hill extended. It was worse than I had initially thought. The base of the hill covered nearly half an acre of my pasture, and the heavy machinery had compacted the soil so badly that it would need to be tilled and amended before anything would grow there again. Around noon, a sheriff's deputy arrived. He was a young guy named Deputy Miller who took the whole situation very seriously. I showed him the property markers, my deed, and the survey map on my phone. He walked the perimeter of the hill and took his own photos. "This is pretty clear-cut," Deputy Miller said. "They're definitely on your property. Do you want me to clear everyone off right now?" I thought about it for a moment. Part of me wanted to see all those entitled HOA families pack up their sleds and leave immediately. But I also knew that causing a scene with kids present would just make me look like the bad guy in the community. "Give me until tomorrow," I said. "I want to serve them with a formal cease and desist first. If they're still here after that, then yes, please come back and enforce the trespass." Deputy Miller nodded. "I'll file this report today. If you need us back out here, just call. And Mr. Lawson, you might want to consider putting up some fencing or clear signage along your property line. These subdivision folks sometimes don't understand how property rights work." After the deputy left, I sat down at my kitchen table and tried to calm down. I had never been one for confrontation, which is probably why I preferred the quiet life of ranching to the corporate world I had left behind in Seattle. But I also was not going to let some HOA president destroy my property and act like she had done me a favor. My phone rang. It was an unknown local number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Mr. Lawson, this is Patricia Henderson from the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. I wanted to reach out to discuss this situation in a more civil manner. I'm listening, I said. I've spoken with our board members, and we're prepared to offer you a compromise. We would like to lease the portion of your property where the hill is located for the remainder of the winter season. We'll pay you $500 per month for February, March, and April. That's $1,500 for doing absolutely nothing. My property isn't for lease, I replied, and the damage you've caused is going to cost significantly more than $1,500 to repair. Patricia sighed dramatically. Mr. Lawson, I'm trying to be reasonable here. The alternative is that this becomes a very ugly dispute. Our HOA has substantial legal resources, and we have very good relationships with the county commissioners. It would be in your best interest to accept our generous offer. I felt my jaw clench. Are you threatening me? I'm simply pointing out the reality of the situation. You're one person with a small cattle operation. We're a homeowners association representing 83 families. Who do you think the county is going to side with? The person whose property rights were violated, I said. I've already filed a police report. My attorney is drafting a cease and desist letter that will be served to your HOA by tomorrow morning. If that hill isn't removed within 7 days, I'll be filing a lawsuit for damages and seeking an injunction. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was ice cold. You're making a mistake, Mr. Lawson. A very big mistake. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there staring at my phone, wondering how a simple property dispute had escalated into threats and intimidation in the span of a few hours. That evening, I fed my cattle and checked on them carefully. They seemed fine, just confused about the sudden change to their environment and the constant noise from the sledding hill. I had 15 head of mixed breeds, mostly Angus and Hereford crosses. They were gentle animals that I had raised from calves, and they trusted me completely. As I stood in the barn looking out at my disrupted pasture, an idea began to form in my mind. It was petty, maybe even a bit vindictive, but it would be completely legal and would solve my problem in a very direct way. If the HOA wanted to use my pasture as a playground, they would have to share it with the livestock that actually belonged there. The next morning, I was up before dawn. I had barely slept, too angry and anxious about the whole situation. Sarah had emailed me the cease and desist letter the night before, and a process server would be delivering it to Patricia Henderson's house this morning. I made coffee and watched from my kitchen window as the first families started arriving at the hill around 8 in the morning. It was a Saturday, so there was a bigger crowd than yesterday. Someone had even brought a portable canopy and was selling hot chocolate and cookies. They were treating my property like a public park. Around 9, I received a text from Sarah confirming that the cease and desist had been served. Patricia had 30 minutes to read it and comply, after which I would be within my rights to take appropriate action. I drank my coffee and waited. 30 minutes passed. Then an hour. The crowd at the hill only grew larger. Around 10:30 my phone rang. It was Patricia. You had me served with legal papers in front of my neighbors, she said, her voice shaking with anger. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was? You have any idea how humiliating it is to wake up and find your property destroyed and occupied by trespassers? I countered. The letter gives you 7 days to remove the hill and restore my property. The clock starts now. We're not removing anything, Patricia said. Our attorney reviewed the situation, and he believes we have a valid claim of adverse possession. If the property line has been in dispute, and we've been making improvements to it, we may have a legal right to continue using it. I almost laughed. Adverse possession in Montana requires hostile and continuous use for 5 years. You've been there for 2 days. Your attorney is either lying to you or incompetent. We'll see what a judge says, Patricia replied. In the meantime, we're not going anywhere. The children deserve this amenity, and you're just being a selfish, bitter man who doesn't understand community values. I hung up without responding. I had given them a chance to do the right thing. Now it was time for Plan B. I walked out to my barn and opened the gates to the cattle pen. My 15 head of cattle looked up at me with their big, trusting eyes. They were used to having access to the eastern pasture, and they had been confused about why I had kept them penned up for the past 2 days. "Come on, girls," I called out, using the feed bucket to guide them. "Time to go back to your pasture." The cattle followed me eagerly, thinking it was feeding time. I led them around the side of the barn and straight toward the sledding hill. As we got closer, I could hear the shrieks and laughter of children sliding down the snow. The parents were standing around chatting, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. I opened the gate to the eastern pasture, the one that the HOA had left standing even as they built their hill on my land. The cattle streamed through, heading straight for their usual grazing area, which just happened to be exactly where the sledding hill was now located. It took about 30 seconds for someone to notice. A woman screamed, then another. Kids started scrambling up the hill to get away from the cattle, even though my cows were among the most docile animals you could ever meet. Parents rushed to grab their children, and the entire scene descended into chaos. Patricia came running over from where she had been standing near the hot chocolate stand. "What are you doing? Get those animals out of here." "These animals live here," I said calmly. "This is their pasture. You built your hill on their home." "This is insane. Someone's going to get hurt." "My cattle are extremely gentle," I replied. "As long as no one provokes them or tries to hurt them, they'll just graze peacefully. Of course, they do tend to leave droppings everywhere, and they might rub against things with their considerable weight, but they're not aggressive." One of my larger cows, a Hereford named Bessie, had wandered right to the base of the hill and started rubbing her side against it. The snow and dirt began to crumble and slide down. A few kids who had been sledding screamed and ran toward their parents. "This is animal endangerment." Patricia shouted. "I'm calling animal control. Please do," I said. "And while you're at it, explain to them why you built a sledding hill in the middle of a cattle pasture. I'm sure they'll be very interested." More of my cattle had wandered over to the hill now, attracted by the commotion and hoping for food. They began grazing on the exposed grass and weeds at the edges where the snow had been scraped away. A couple of the younger steers decided the hill looked interesting and started walking up the side of it, their hooves punching through the packed snow. The sledding had completely stopped. Parents were gathering their kids in their sleds, shooting me dirty looks as they headed back toward the subdivision. Patricia stood there with her arms crossed, her face bright red from either cold or anger, probably both. "You haven't won anything," she said. "This is harassment, and it's going to cost you." "This is my livestock on my property," I replied. "What's happening right now is completely legal. What you did by building that hill without permission, that's what's illegal. You've got 6 more days to remove it, or I'll see you in court." I turned and walked back to my house, leaving my cattle to enjoy their reclaimed pasture. I could hear Patricia on her phone, shouting at someone about the situation. I almost felt bad for whoever was on the receiving end of that call. Almost. Over the next few days, the situation became the talk of the community. The local newspaper, the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, got wind of the dispute and sent a reporter out to interview both sides. I gave them my property survey, showed them the police report, and explained calmly that I was simply exercising my legal property rights. Patricia gave them a lengthy quote about how I was a menace to the community and that children needed safe places to play. The resulting article was surprisingly balanced, laying out the facts of the property dispute without taking sides. But the comments section online was a war zone. People from the subdivision called me selfish and cruel. Rural property owners from around the county praised me for standing up to HOA overreach. It became a proxy battle between urban and rural values, between individual property rights and community interests. My cattle, oblivious to the controversy, seemed quite happy to have their pasture back. They grazed peacefully around the hill, and yes, they did leave substantial evidence of their presence all over the area. The hill itself began to deteriorate quickly. Between the cattle rubbing against it, walking on it, and the natural settling of the hastily constructed mound, it started to look less like a winter recreation facility and more like a muddy, dung-covered mess. Families from the subdivision stopped coming to sled. Partly because of the cattle, partly because of the condition of the hill, and partly because the story had become so contentious that being seen there felt like taking a side in the dispute. On the 5th day after I had served the cease and desist, Sarah called me. We got a response from the HOA's attorney. They're refusing to remove the hill, and they're countersuing you for harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress. On what grounds? I asked. They claim that you deliberately released cattle into an area where you knew children would be playing, creating a dangerous situation. They're also claiming that your cattle have destroyed HOA property, namely the Sledding Hill, and they're seeking damages for the cost of construction. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. They built that hill on my property without permission. I know, Sarah said, and we have all the documentation to prove it, but they're not going to make this easy. They filed their counterclaim in district court, which means this is going to drag out for months, possibly over a year. The legal fees alone could run into tens of thousands of dollars. What are my options? We can file for a temporary restraining order to force them to stay off your property while the case proceeds. Given that you have clear documentation of your property boundaries and they don't have any legitimate claim, I think a judge would grant it. But that still requires going to court, and they're going to fight it every step of the way. Do it, I said. File for the restraining order. I'm not backing down. The hearing for the temporary restraining order was scheduled for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, my cattle continued to occupy the pasture, and the Sledding Hill continued to deteriorate. The HOA put up signs at the edge of the subdivision warning residents to stay away from the dangerous cattle area, which made me sound like I was running some kind of wild animal preserve instead of a small ranch. I started receiving nasty notes in my mailbox. They were anonymous, but clearly from subdivision residents. They called me cruel, heartless, and a blight on the community. Someone spray-painted cattle killer on my mailbox, which was both inaccurate and ironic given that my cattle were alive and well. Deputy Miller came by a few times to check on things and make sure no one was vandalizing my property beyond the mailbox incident. He seemed sympathetic to my situation, but he also warned me that tensions were running high. Some of these HOA folks are pretty worked up, he said. I'd recommend getting some security cameras installed, just in case. I took his advice and installed 4 cameras covering the approaches to my property and the disputed pasture area. The footage would prove useful sooner than I expected. 3 days before the hearing, I was reviewing the camera footage from the previous night when I noticed something suspicious. Around 2 in the morning, 2 figures had entered my pasture and appeared to be spreading something on the ground. I couldn't make out exactly what they were doing in the darkness, but it was clearly deliberate. I bundled up and went out to investigate. What I found made my blood run cold. Someone had scattered nails, screws, and pieces of broken glass throughout the pasture. If my cattle stepped on any of this debris, they could be seriously injured or even killed. I immediately called Deputy Miller, then spent the next 4 hours carefully walking the pasture and picking up every piece of metal and glass I could find. I filled 2 buckets with the dangerous debris. By the time Deputy Miller arrived around 9 in the morning, I was exhausted and furious. "This is attempted animal cruelty," Deputy Miller said, examining the buckets of nails and glass. "This could have killed your livestock. Do your cameras show who did it?" "2 people, but I can't make out their faces in the dark. They came from the direction of the subdivision." "I'll need copies of that footage. This is a criminal matter now. If we can identify who did this, they're looking at felony charges." Deputy Miller took the buckets of debris as evidence and filed a report. He also went door to door in the subdivision asking if anyone had seen anything suspicious that night. No one had, or at least no one was willing to say. The incident did change the tone of the dispute, though. When the local newspaper reported that someone had tried to injure or kill my cattle, public opinion began to shift. Even some subdivision residents who had been critical of me admitted in the comments that sabotaging livestock crossed a line. The hearing for the temporary restraining order arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in late January. The Gallatin County Courthouse in Bozeman was an impressive building, and I felt distinctly out of place in my sport coat and jeans among all the attorneys in their suits. Sarah met me outside the courtroom and went over what to expect. The judge will hear arguments from both sides, review the evidence, and make a ruling. This isn't a full trial, so it will be relatively quick. Just answer any questions honestly and directly. The HOA was represented by their attorney, a slick-looking guy named Richard Vance who wore a suit that probably cost more than my truck. Patricia Henderson was there too, sitting in the gallery and glaring at me like I had personally wronged her. Judge Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to my attorney, presided over the hearing. She was in her early 60s with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She reviewed the documentation from both sides in silence for several minutes before speaking. "Mr. Vance, help me understand your client's position. The survey maps clearly show that the Sledding Hill was constructed on Mr. Lawson's property, not on HOA common land. What is the basis for your client's claim?" Richard Vance stood up smoothly. "Your Honor, while the survey maps do show that the hill may technically extend onto Mr. Lawson's property, the boundary line in that area has been poorly marked for years. The HOA had a reasonable belief that they were building on common land. Furthermore, Mr. Lawson's actions in releasing cattle into an area where he knew children would be playing constitutes reckless endangerment." Judge Morrison looked at him over her reading glasses. "Mr. Lawson released his own livestock onto his own property. How is that reckless endangerment?" "The cattle were released deliberately to disrupt a community recreation facility and to intimidate families with young children. This was not normal ranching activity. This was harassment." The judge turned to Sarah. "Miss Morrison, your response." Sarah stood and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, Mr. Lawson's property rights are well documented and undisputed. The HOA trespassed on his land, destroyed approximately half an acre of winter pasture, and refused multiple requests to cease their activities. Mr. Lawson's cattle have been grazing that pasture for 5 years. Their presence is entirely normal and appropriate. What is abnormal is the HOA's construction of an unauthorized facility on someone else's private property. Judge Morrison nodded. I've reviewed the police report, the property surveys, and the photographic evidence. The facts here are quite clear. Mr. Vance, does your client have any documentation suggesting they had permission to use Mr. Lawson's property? No, Your Honor, but we maintain that the boundary dispute creates reasonable ambiguity. There is no boundary dispute, Judge Morrison said sharply. There are survey markers. There are recorded property lines. Your client simply chose to ignore them. Mr. Lawson, please stand. I stood up, my heart pounding. Mr. Lawson, have you or your cattle caused any physical harm to any person? No, Your Honor. My cattle are docile and well-trained. They've never hurt anyone. Are your cattle up to date on all health certifications and vaccinations? Yes, Your Honor. I have documentation from my veterinarian. Judge Morrison nodded. I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA and all its members are hereby ordered to stay off Mr. Lawson's property, specifically the eastern pasture area where the sledding hill was constructed. The HOA has 30 days to remove the hill and restore the property to its original condition at their expense. If they fail to do so, Mr. Lawson is authorized to have the work done and bill the HOA for the costs. This order is effective immediately. Patricia Henderson let out an audible gasp from the gallery. Richard Vance's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, I'm referring this matter to the county prosecutor's office. The evidence suggests that the HOA knowingly trespassed and caused significant property damage. There may be criminal charges warranted in addition to the civil matters. The gavel came down, and the hearing was over. Sarah and I walked out of the courtroom while Richard Vance and Patricia had a heated, whispered conversation near their table. That went as well as we could have hoped, Sarah said. The restraining order gives you clear legal protection, and the referral to the prosecutor means they're taking this seriously. What happens now? I asked. They have 30 days to remove the hill. If they don't, we document that they failed to comply, and you can hire a contractor to do the work. Then we sue them for the costs plus damages. The criminal investigation will proceed separately. I drove home feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The legal victory felt good, but I knew the dispute was far from over. The HOA wasn't going to give up easily, and Patricia Henderson struck me as someone who held grudges. Over the next week, nothing happened. The sledding hill sat there, slowly melting and eroding as February brought warmer temperatures. My cattle continued to graze around it, and I continued to document everything with photos and videos. On the 8th day after the hearing, I woke up to find a contractor's truck and excavator parked near the hill. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope that the HOA was actually complying with the court order. Then, I saw what they were doing. They weren't removing the hill. They were expanding it. I grabbed my phone and started recording video as I walked toward the construction site. A man in a hard hat was operating the excavator, pushing more dirt and snow onto the existing hill. Another worker was spreading it with a shovel. "What are you doing?" I called out over the noise of the machinery. The man in the hard hat shut off the excavator and climbed down. "I'm just following the work order from the HOA. They said to reinforce the hill." "You know there's a restraining order against the HOA being on this property?" I asked. The man's face went pale. "No, sir. I was just hired to do the work. They gave me an address and a work order." I showed him the court document on my phone. "This property is involved in a legal dispute. The HOA is not allowed to be here or to have anyone working here on their behalf." The contractor immediately started packing up his equipment. I'm not getting involved in this. I'll bill the HOA for my time today, but I'm not coming back." After he left, I called Sarah. "They violated the restraining order. They tried to expand the hill instead of removing it." "That's contempt of court," Sarah said. "Send me the video you took. I'll file an emergency motion. The judge is not going to be happy about this." The emergency hearing was scheduled for 2 days later. This time, Judge Morrison looked genuinely angry as she reviewed the video evidence. "Mr. Vance, I'm trying to understand how your client thought it was appropriate to not only ignore a court order, but to actively violate it by expanding their construction on Mr. Lawson's property." Richard Vance looked uncomfortable for the first time since I had met him. "Your Honor, there was a miscommunication within the HOA board. The contractor was hired before the restraining order was issued, and the work order wasn't properly canceled." "The restraining order was issued 9 days ago," Judge Morrison said. "That's plenty of time to cancel a contractor." "This appears to be willful contempt. I'm imposing a fine of $5,000 on the Meadowbrook Heights HOA, payable immediately to the court. I'm also reducing the timeline for removal of the hill from 30 days to 14 days. If the HOA fails to comply, I'll hold the board members individually in contempt, which could result in jail time. Am I making myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Richard Vance said quietly. "And Mr. Vance, I strongly suggest you advise your client that I do not take violations of my orders lightly. The next time we're in this courtroom, it better be because they've complied fully, not because they've found another creative way to ignore the law." As we left the courthouse this time, I noticed that Patricia Henderson looked shaken. The threat of individual board members facing jail time had apparently broken through her stubborn conviction that the HOA could do whatever it wanted. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA finally hired a different contractor to remove the Sledding hill. It took 3 days of work with heavy equipment to dismantle the mound and haul away the dirt and debris. The contractor also did some basic grading to restore the pasture to approximately its original contour, but the damage to my grazing land was extensive. The soil was compacted from the heavy machinery, both from the original construction and the removal. The grass and vegetation that had been scraped away would need to be reseeded in the spring. I hired a land management consultant to assess the damage and prepare an estimate for full restoration. The estimate came back at $32,000. That included tilling the compacted soil, amending it with organic matter, reseeding with appropriate grass species, installing temporary fencing to keep the cattle off while the vegetation established, and loss of use for at least 1 growing season. Sarah filed an amended lawsuit seeking $32,000 in actual damages, plus $15,000 in punitive damages, plus legal fees. The HOA's attorney tried to negotiate a settlement, but we rejected their initial offer of $10,000. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about accountability. The criminal investigation was moving forward as well. The county prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, took the case seriously. She charged the HOA as an entity, and Patricia Henderson individually with criminal trespass and property damage, both misdemeanors under Montana law. She also continued investigating the nail and glass incident, but without clear evidence of who was responsible, those charges remained pending. Patricia Henderson's criminal trial was scheduled for late March. In the meantime, she resigned as HOA president, though whether that was voluntary or under pressure from other board members, I never found out. The new president was a reasonable man named Tom Winters who reached out to me with a sincere apology. "I want you to know that not everyone in the subdivision supported what Patricia did. Tom said when he called. A lot of us thought the sledding hill was a bad idea from the start. We just got steamrolled by her personality. I appreciate you saying that, I replied, but the HOA as an entity is still responsible for what happened. I understand. I'm authorized to offer you a settlement of $35,000 to cover all your damages and legal fees. We'll also make a formal public apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing. We just want this resolved. I discussed it with Sarah, and we agreed that $35,000 was a reasonable settlement given the costs and risks of going to trial. The HOA paid within a week, and I received a formal letter of apology signed by all current board members. Patricia Henderson's criminal trial was shorter than expected. She pleaded no contest to the charges and was sentenced to 6 months probation, 100 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution of $5,000 directly to me for the initial property damage. The judge also gave her a stern lecture about respecting property rights and the rule of law. I attended the sentencing hearing, not out of vindictiveness, but because I wanted to see the conclusion of this whole ordeal. Patricia looked diminished somehow, less imperious than she had been. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she turned toward me. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time, she actually seemed to mean it. "I got carried away with wanting to create something nice for the community, and I completely disregarded your rights. That was wrong, and I take responsibility for it." I nodded at her. It didn't erase what she had done, but it was something. The investigation into the nail and glass incident eventually went cold. Without clear evidence of who was responsible, the prosecutor couldn't bring charges. I suspected it was someone from the subdivision who had been caught up in Patricia's rhetoric about me being the enemy of the community, but I had no proof and eventually decided to let it go. Spring came to Montana with its usual dramatic transformation. The snow melted, the grass started growing, and my cattle got fat on the new vegetation. I used some of the settlement money to hire a landscaping company to restore the damaged pasture. They tilled the soil, added compost and amendments, and seeded it with a mix of native grasses and clover. By late April, you could barely tell that anything had happened. The eastern pasture was green and lush, and my cattle grazed there peacefully, unaware of all the drama that had occurred over that patch of ground. The subdivision, meanwhile, seemed to have learned a lesson. The new HOA board was much more conservative in their approach, sticking to managing common areas that they actually owned. Tom Winters stopped by one day with a bottle of whiskey as a peace offering. "Some of the families wanted me to ask if there would be any chance of leasing that pasture for a sledding hill next winter," he said, then quickly added, "With your permission, a formal contract and fair compensation, of course." I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. "I appreciate the proper approach this time, but no, that's grazing land for my cattle, that's what it's for, and that's what it's going to stay." Tom nodded. "Fair enough. I figured I should ask, but I understand. For what it's worth, we're looking at buying a small piece of land on the other side of the subdivision for a park. We'll put a sledding hill there if it works out." "That sounds like a much better plan," I said. "How about this? When you get that park built, I'll donate some time with one of my gentler cows for kids to meet. Educational thing. Show them where their burgers come from and all that." Tom's face lit up. "That would actually be amazing. A lot of these kids have never been near a farm animal. Let me talk to the board about it." We shook hands, and for the first time since that January morning when I woke up to find a sledding hill on my pasture, I felt like the conflict was truly over. The legal settlement paid for the restoration of my land with money left over. I used some of it to finally fix up my barn, which had needed repairs for years. I also invested in better fencing along the property line between my ranch and the subdivision. Not because I expected more problems, but because good fences make good neighbors, as the saying goes. Deputy Miller stopped by one afternoon in May to check on how things had turned out. We stood in my pasture, now green and thriving, and he nodded approvingly. "I'm glad this resolved without anyone getting seriously hurt or worse," he said. "Property disputes can get ugly fast. You handled it the right way through the legal system." "I had good help," I replied. "And honestly, if they had just asked permission in the first place, I might have worked something out with them." It was the entitlement and the refusal to acknowledge they had done something wrong that bothered me most. Deputy Miller smiled. "That's the thing about some HOA types. They get so used to having authority within their little subdivision that they forget the rest of the world doesn't have to follow their rules." A month later, I got a letter in the mail from Sarah. It was a newspaper clipping from the Bozeman Daily Chronicle. The article reported that the Meadowbrook Heights HOA had purchased 2 acres of land on the north side of their subdivision and was developing it into a community park with a sledding hill, playground, and picnic area. The article mentioned that the project was inspired by a previous failed attempt that had violated a neighboring property owner's rights. I pinned the article to my refrigerator. It felt like vindication, proof that standing up for your rights could lead to positive outcomes, even if the path there was difficult. Tom Winters followed through on the educational farm visit idea. In June, I brought Bessie, my most docile Hereford, to the new park for a Meet a Cow event. About 30 kids showed up with their parents. I talked about ranching, cattle care, and where beef comes from. Bessie was a perfect ambassador, letting kids pet her and posing for photos. Patricia Henderson was not there, and I heard through the grapevine that she had moved out of the subdivision shortly after her probation ended. Apparently, the shame of the criminal conviction and the failed Sledding Hill project had made living there uncomfortable. I felt a twinge of sympathy for her, but mostly I was just glad the whole ordeal was behind me. As summer moved into fall, life returned to its peaceful routine. I took care of my cattle, maintained my property, and enjoyed the quiet of rural Montana. The subdivision next door went about its business, and we coexisted without incident. On a cool October evening, I stood on my porch and looked out over my land. The eastern pasture, where all the drama had unfolded, was now indistinguishable from the rest of my property. The grass was thick and healthy, and my cattle grazed contentedly in the fading light. I thought about everything that had happened since that January morning. The anger, the frustration, the legal battles, the eventual resolution. It had been exhausting and expensive and stressful. But I had defended my property rights, held people accountable for their actions, and come out the other side with my land intact and my principles uncompromised. The cattle ambled toward the barn for their evening feeding, and I grabbed my bucket of grain. As I walked across my land, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The HOA had built their sledding hill on my pasture, but I had taken back what was mine, not through violence or revenge, but through patience, documentation, and the legal system. And somewhere in Meadowbrook Heights subdivision, kids were now sledding on a hill that the HOA actually owned, having learned an expensive lesson about property rights. I smiled to myself as I filled the feeding troughs and watched my cattle eat their dinner. Sometimes the good guys do win. Sometimes standing up for what's right actually works out. And sometimes releasing your cattle into a pasture that belongs to them in the first place is all the revenge you need. As winter approached again, almost a full year after the Sledding Hill incident, I received an invitation to the Meadowbrook Heights annual holiday party. It was a gesture of goodwill from Tom Winters and the HOA board, a symbolic olive branch to show that the past was behind us. I decided to attend, more out of curiosity than anything else. The party was held at the new community park, complete with a professionally designed sledding hill that was smaller but better constructed than Patricia's ill-fated project. Lights were strung up, there was hot chocolate and cookies, and families were gathered around fire pits talking and laughing. Tom spotted me and came over with a smile. "Carter, I'm glad you came. Welcome." "Nice setup you have here," I said, gesturing at the park. "Looks like it turned out well." It did. And honestly, as much as I hate to admit it, the whole mess with your property ended up making this better. We had to do it right, get proper surveys, file all the permits. This park is going to serve the community for decades. Several other subdivision residents came over to introduce themselves. A few apologized for the hostility during the dispute. Most were just friendly and curious about ranch life. I found myself actually enjoying the conversation. As the evening wore on and I prepared to leave, I noticed a family arrive at the sledding hill. The father was helping his young daughter onto a sled while the mother watched and took photos. The girl, maybe 7 years old, squealed with delight as she slid down the hill. It was a scene of pure, innocent joy, and I realized that this was what Patricia Henderson had wanted all along. She had just gone about it in the worst possible way, trampling over someone else's rights in her eagerness to create something for her community. I didn't regret standing up for my property or holding her accountable, but I could acknowledge that her intentions, misguided and illegal as her methods were, had come from a place of wanting to do something good. As I drove home that night, past my pasture where my cattle were sleeping in the barn safe from the winter cold, I felt a sense of closure. The story had a villain, a conflict, and a resolution. But more than that, it had a lesson. That property rights matter, that the law exists to protect individuals from even well-intentioned overreach, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply insisting on your rights and letting the system work. The sledding hill that the HOA had built on my pasture was gone, removed and forgotten. But the one they built on their own land would bring joy to children for years to come. In a strange way, my cattle had saved the HOA from themselves, forcing them to stop and do things properly. I pulled into my driveway and parked the truck. The ranch was quiet and peaceful, exactly as it should be. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled and one of my cattle lowed softly in response. These were the sounds of home, of a life lived on your own terms on your own land. The HOA had learned their lesson about property boundaries. I had learned some things too, about standing firm, about documentation, and about the importance of giving people a chance to make things right. But most importantly, I had learned that sometimes the best way to end someone's winter fun isn't through conflict or confrontation. Sometimes all it takes is 15 head of cattle, a pasture that rightfully belongs to them, and the quiet insistence that some lines simply cannot be crossed. No matter how many children want to sled down a hill, life went on as it always does. The seasons turned, the cattle grazed, and the subdivision next door buzzed with activity on land that was actually theirs. And in the end, that was all I had ever wanted, for everyone to respect the boundaries, literal and figurative, that keep a community functioning. The Sledding Hill incident became a story I would occasionally tell at the feed store or the local bar, usually to raised eyebrows and headshakes. It became part of the local lore, a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and one rancher's quiet but effective resistance. But mostly, it just became the past. My cattle never knew they had been soldiers in a property rights battle. They just knew that they had their pasture back, and that was enough. And in the quiet satisfaction of watching them graze on restored land that was indisputably mine, I found my own peace with everything that had happened. The winter passed, another spring came, and life continued on the ranch. The eastern pasture grew thick and green each year, better than it had been before, thanks to the restoration work. If there was any silver lining to the whole ordeal, it was that my land was now in better condition than when it started. And every time I looked at that pasture, I remembered the sledding hill that briefly stood there, the chaos that followed, and the ultimate victory of common sense and property rights. It was a reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it makes you temporarily unpopular, is always worth it in the end. The cattle grazed, the seasons changed, and life on the ranch went on. And that, more than any legal victory or financial settlement, was the best outcome I could have hoped for.